A Science of Change, podcasts by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organizational development practitioner since 1984. I'm Gilmore Crosby, and this is my first podcast. I have been influenced by the social science of Kurt Lewin all my life. My father was a practitioner of Lewinian organization development and taught me much of what I know. I'm blessed that he's still with us here as I begin my podcasting career. He's 95 and continues to be sharp of mind, writing various articles. We just published yet another co-authored article in the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science. And so Kurt Lewin was born in 1890 in Magilno, which at the time was a province of Germany, and is currently part of Poland. Lewin was a Jewish male who grew up prior to World War I, actually fought and served with the German army in World War I, and rose as far as he could in their ranks. The ability to be promoted was sharply curtailed because he was Jewish. He faced many restrictions on his life because he was Jewish, long before the Nazis rose to power. The Jewish people were the subject of prejudice, systemic racism in Germany. And so Lewin also taught at the University of Berlin, but could not become a tenured professor. His parents were farmers, but they could not own their own farm. They had to lease it from from Germans who were not Jewish. So he faced many restrictions and open state-sponsored prejudice from the time he was born. And so he was very interested in democracy and what he called minority relations. Minority relations being any power imbalance against a group. So any group that is given less status in a society, they don't have to be the minority. If you go back to, of course, the Jewish experience under Roman rule during the time of Jesus, you have the same powerlessness, even though the Jewish people in their own homeland were the majority at the time. So Lewin's model is about power more than it is about like the size of your population. And so it applies to women throughout much of history. They are in a minority relations position, which means so Lewin's social science is so fabulous because it applies to your individual experience, it applies to group experience, it applies to nation states. He heavily influenced the reconstruction of Germany after World War II. He was an influence on the Roosevelts and the State Department. He did lots of work for the U.S. government once he fled here from Germany. So he came out of the German army in World War I and already was writing from the perspective of a social scientist. He said that the experience of being in a zone as a soldier was different than the experience of being a civilian. which may seem obvious, but the perception alters based on your role and your circumstances. How you look at the world, whether you see a house as shelter and possible food and supplies, or whether you see it as someone's private residence, changes dramatically in a war zone. And so the experience of human beings likewise changes based on the groups they're in, based on the society they're in. It totally applies to the United States in the present. If you are powerless, relatively speaking, as the African American community has been in this culture, then you are facing systemic influences such as the PPP loans. The PPP loans, which were completely guaranteed by the U.S. government, were still hard for black people to access. And so the systemic racism that goes on today is subtle. And so it's easy to miss it, especially if you're in the majority and if you feel defensive about race relations. It's easy to say, well, there's an even playing field. And now, I mean, that was history, but now it should be based on your abilities. Well, if it was just based on abilities, then women would be mechanics, because women ran all the factories during World War II. But because of social relations, we as a culture laid them all off as soon as the war was over, no matter how well the factories ran, and said that they should be housewives or nurses or teachers. And so there were strict limitations on what women could do, and there are still limits on how women are perceived in terms of being able to be authority figures. Can they be the president of the United States? Or do we hold biases collectively that says it should be a tall man that's the president of the United States? Social bias is really tricky, and it can be as simple as whether or not you're taller or shorter, whether your voice is deep. And so all of this stuff is available to us today to understand the current struggles we have in this country. I wrote my 6th book, Diversity Without Dogma, a collaborative approach to leading DEI, which stands for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So a collaborative approach to leading DEI education and action. And this is based on Lewin's social science. Lewin conducted research. He called it action research because it was almost always involving trying to change either society or what's happening in an organization. And his research was consistent. So, for example, during the Great Depression, we also had drought conditions in the Midwest. And so the Dust Bowl years. And the U.S. government wanted farmers to irrigate differently. Well, they weren't having much luck. Back then, they had to get on a train and go out to the Midwest and gather some farmers. And so these were white men in suits from Washington, D.C., trying to tell farmers how to farm. And so one thing that Lewinian social science shows is that if you try to force change on people, they will resist. If somebody tries to get you to be different today, there's a good chance you'll resist. Doesn't mean that you're screwed up. It just means that you're a normal human being and you have a reaction when people try to force you to be different. If somebody tries to sell you a different lifestyle, sell you a car that you don't want, sell you a bridge in Florida, you're probably smart enough to say no. Maybe you'll politely nod your head and even act interested, depending on who's doing the selling, like if it's your boss. And you still can think for yourself. That's one of the strengths of being a human being. We can think for ourselves. And so Lewin understood that if you want people to change, you have to respect that. You have to let people think for themselves. If they think for themselves and implement solutions that make sense to them, they'll be more committed to the solution and they'll probably get it done. So again, going back to these farmers in the Midwest, the government said to Lewin, because he was helping them with various social science situations, with change situations, that so he went out to the Midwest with the government experts, and he did what he did over and over again. He had a control group, which means a group of people who are not getting a social science approach. So the lecturers would lecture to the farmers, and then Lewin helped them track how many changes actually got implemented by the farmers that simply got lectured to. Which also brings us to passive versus active learning. If you want people to change, Lewin's social science shows that you have to engage them out loud. You have to get them talking and interacting. People are social. And when they can think out loud with other peers and not feel fear of being shamed for what they think, then they will be able to start to experiment with their own thinking if there is reason to do so. So the farmers, for example, some would just be lectured at. Then Lewin would take the same lecturer, a different group of farmers, and say to the lecturer, look, don't make this a sales pitch. Don't try to tell them what to do. Give them a nutshell of the information that you have. And then after that had occurred, he would say to the farmers, now farmers, what do you think? Turn and talk to each other. What makes sense to you? What does this government expertise have to offer that makes sense to you? What doesn't make sense? What do you know that the government expert doesn't know? What can you do? What are your own solutions? And so the farmers would talk to each other, and then they would come up with ideas. Some were the same as the expert ideas, but many were altered, and altered in small ways because the farmers weren't facing, the experts were not facing the same conditions. The people facing the challenge that's being addressed know more about it, know more about their daily experience than any expert can ever know. So this is critical to organization development, which was a field created out of mostly Lewinian social science. There's been other people that have influenced it, of course, and some in ways that don't make sense. But the Lewinian approach has the people who are facing the challenge thinking for themselves, thinking out loud. It's a group dynamic. And once they have committed out loud with their peers to taking action, they went out and took action. The 80% of the stuff that they intended got done. They irrigated differently based on that. And the same was true of people's food habits. The government wanted people to handle food differently during World War II. The people were rejecting the government advice. And so Lewin did the same kind of experiment. Let the people who are being addressed, in this case it was women, because the government research had shown that women were the biggest influence on what people consumed in the home in terms of food habits. And so the women were given the opportunity to talk to each other and to think out loud. They came up with solutions and they implemented them and they sustained them. So this happened over and over again when you allow people to think for themselves. My father started applying this type of theory back in the 1950s. And he was fortunate to run into Lewin's immediate associates. Lewin died at 57 in 1947, so rather prematurely. But the people he had influenced over the years, there was a strong group of them spread all over the place. And so Dad walked in seminary as he was becoming a Methodist minister. He walked into what was called a T group workshop experience at Boston University. And so he was immediately immersed in learning by thinking out loud amongst a group and influencing your peers and having them influence you. And it was called a T group because it was a training group. So the person leading the group provides behavioral science information, like about interpersonal communication and conflict and leadership. And then the group talks about what they understand about the information. They try to apply it. Skills like making sure that you verbally verify what you think the other person meant. That's called paraphrasing. So there's simple behavioral skills that you can then apply, and it's a practice group. That's what a T group is, for applying techniques like noticing what you're feeling. So it's an emotional intelligence process. Lewin was very clear about emotions in groups. If you tell them what to do and you treat them like children, they will probably rebel, and they'll feel tense if you try to force things on them. This is a mistake that almost all my customer organizations, well, maybe I should say all of them, make. They try to force solutions from other places where it's worked. It's worked well enough that it's considered a useful solution. They try to, like lean manufacturing, they try to force it on people, and so it gets implemented poorly. And so the people blame the solution, and the organization usually just tries to recover from chaos and come up with another solution to force on the people, not realizing that it's the change process itself that they are screwing up. And the same thing holds for working on any kind of prejudice, racism, sexism, homophobia, any kind of prejudice. If you, as is a popular thing these days, like have a training and you get everyone in the room, and let's say it's racism is the subject, many of the trainers begin by saying something like, because there's systemic racism in the United States, which there is, then, and I can, go over, and I will in my podcast, spend time on the evidence of that, because you have to think for yourself. You who are listening to this have to think for yourself. And, the big limitation of this type of offering information is that you're not with somebody else right now. You're just listening to me. You can't even talk to me. It would be helpful if you took this information and maybe had a friend listen to it, and then you talked out loud about it. What makes sense to you? What doesn't make sense? The odds of you really retaining it and putting it into practice are much higher. So if you're in a training on racism and the instructor says all white people are racist because we're in a systemically racist society, and if you say that you're not racist, that just proves you're racist. You're just being defensive. Well, the odds are that all the white people in that room are going to feel defensive. And then some of these trainers go on to say that's proof that you're racist. So it's a catch. It's circular reasoning. It leads to increased tension. It may be comforting to the people who have less power that are in the room, and there's some value in that. But mostly it leads to, as Lewin's research showed, the people that you really want to have change digging in even more into their beliefs that this is all crazy and being forced on them by people who have some kind of agenda that they don't agree with, like to take away their power, or at least that don't respect the progress they've made on their own in life, which of course every individual makes progress. And so the whole conversation gets stuck and polarized. And that's the easiest thing to do when you're talking about difficult subjects, is to get stuck in polarities. So it's all true, none of it's true. And so that is how a lot of DEI training is conducted. It's a mistake. Don't do it. You have to figure out how, and there are plenty of people doing this also, to welcome anyone who cares about the subject of racism or sexism, etc. You've got to figure out how to welcome them in, get them engaged in conversation, and get them engaged in thinking about what they could do different. You don't have to have everyone do introspection about their biases. It's great if you notice your own biases. There's nothing wrong with that. But you can take action even if you're biased. Even if you think that as a male you're a better driver than a female, even if you know you have that bias, it doesn't mean you have to live by it. You can let females drive, and you can keep your mouth shut if you're stressed. And you do well to critique your own driving. Are you really staying conscious while you're driving of the hazards? Or are you so cocky about your driving that you are now just going along on autopilot? Well, then you're probably not a very good driver. Do you get mad at other drivers and blame them, and then start driving differently, perhaps more aggressively because of experiences you've had? Well, you're probably not a very good driver. I tend to think that there's a lot of really bad drivers out there, but that's a whole different subject. Most people, maybe it's the same subject, most people believe that they're the best driver. And most people also believe that they're experts on people, on how to understand people. And so we tend to personalize interactions and use psychology in very shallow ways to characterize other people. Oh, they're uptight. Oh, they're too quiet. Oh, they talk too much. And so all of that is not systemic. Lewinian social science is systemic. You can look at a person in their context and understand better your own behavior in that context. So that includes authority relationships, which are huge variables in organizations and in society. So Lewinian social science says, if you are following or leading, the same dynamics apply. As a leader, you had better create as much opportunity for people to influence as possible and give them as much structure as possible. So you want to take clear stands. Now, this is adding in family systems thinking from Murray Bowen and Edwin Friedman, both who were at lectures at the Menninger Institute when Lewin was lecturing. So were almost certainly influenced, but also believed in many of the same dynamics. For instance, they took the sciences, the physical sciences, and they applied them to human behavior, just as Lewin did. Social science is a mixture of anthropology, psychology, sociology. It's a mixture, and it's looking at if you're in a power relationship in an organization, then for one, you're likely to have fear of the authority figure. Some of that, going back to family systems, comes from your early experiences. However the authority figures were when you were a little child influences how you react to authority figures as an adult. And that's a wise thing to spend time reflecting on. What lessons did I learn? Am I so afraid of anger because I didn't like how it was expressed by adults when I was a kid that I am unaware of my own anger? And so I'm also unaware of the part of me that is serious about something, wants to take clear stands. To take clear stands, you have to be serious. To confront people in a positive way, you have to be serious. You have to say, this behavior is acceptable, this behavior is not acceptable. To do all of that, you have to understand authority within you and your relationship to it. And then you have to create conditions if you want to have high performance and high morale in an organization. Again, Lewin's research showed that a leader who creates as much influence as possible, but also as much clarity about who decides what needs to be done, where are we headed, they get the highest results from groups. If the leader does all the thinking, which is what happens in most organizations by accident, the leadership is doing 99% of the thinking and imposing solutions. And then they're saying, how come people are passive? How come the workforce has low morale? What's wrong with them? Maybe we need new people. Instead of thinking about how their own leadership behaviors are influencing the results they're getting. So that's systemic thinking. How is my own behavior influencing the results I'm getting at home and at work? If you can predict patterns at home or at work, then you're part of the pattern. And the mistake is to keep trying to change everybody else. As Gandhi put it, be the change you want to see in the world. Start with yourself, make changes to yourself, and you'll start to influence differently. Everyone wants to influence. In Lewinian social science, that's part of the theory, makes sense to me. Everybody wants to influence. The question is, are you a scientist of how you go about trying to influence? And is it working the way you want it to? If you want to see the changes in the organization, in your family, and in the world that you care about, then apply Lewinian social science. You can buy my books. So Diversity Without Dogma is the latest. They're all on Amazon. My first was called Fight, Flight, Freeze. I wrote it in 2008. I've written 6 books. And this takes, Fight, Flight, Freeze, takes the theories that we were teaching at the time and mostly are still teaching when we do T group workshops in organizations, which we do, my colleagues and I. It takes those theories and puts it into a self-help book. You can just read through the theories. Do you start with yourself when you're tense, or do you only focus on what's wrong with others? Do you know your emotions and understand your reactivity, your fight, flight, freeze reactions? Do you know how to calm yourself when you're being reactive? Do you know how to understand your patterns during conflict? Some people stay quiet when there's conflict. Some people jump right in. So what are your patterns during conflict? And where do you really stand as a leader or a follower? The people that are leading you are only as good as the information they're getting. Are you offering information to them in a way that they have the most likelihood of hearing it? Or are you avoiding telling them things that they need to know and just blaming them? Which is, again, what most people do. Most people are trained to blame others. It starts in childhood, especially if you had siblings. Wasn't me. And it goes on through life. And so a great place to get a summary of all this is from my book, Plan Change. Why Kurt Lewin's social science is still best practice for business results, change management, and human progress. Because we don't have to reinvent change. We just need to start doing it more effectively, more broadly, more people across the culture. People in areas with high gun violence are the ones who are best positioned to affect things locally. We also need to affect things nationally. So both things need to occur to solve certain problems. And if we want to really have an even playing field someday, we have to affect things locally and nationally. I'm trying to get my lender right now, my bank, to talk to me about their lending practices. How do they know that they aren't prejudiced in their lending practices? They don't really want to talk about it so far. So I'm going to have to be persistent. But it's a simple question, really. And they either have a system for making sure or they don't. Because, again, if you go back to the PPP loans, all across the United States, if black people came in with the same financial condition as a white person, the white person would get the PPP loan almost assuredly, and the black person would probably get turned down almost equally assuredly. And it wasn't because there was a vast network of white people saying, don't lend to black people. It had to do with individual biases. All of those loans, again, were 100% backed by the U.S. government. And when black people went online and used a banking system online to apply, they got accepted. They got accepted because there was no bias about race when it was done online. So we have to be better if we ever want to overcome racism in this country. And we have to do it with social science. We have to look at things from a social science point of view. I'll give you one more example from Lewin. He was involved in race relations in Connecticut, a workshop. And what he found was that when groups of people from the same organization or the same area came to the workshop, that later they would get things implemented. Individuals that came alone were much more likely to get things done. And so he created this whole T-group learning workshop methodology for groups from organizations and places. And that was the way to influence in a way that would be sustainable. Over the years, unfortunately, the T-group, as it's run by most people, was afraid of having people from the same organization. They were afraid that people would hold things against each other because T-groups were run poorly by a lot of people. They weren't trained in how to run a T-group. And so they got really popular in the 50s and 60s, and people turned them into more like a psychology group where you took turns analyzing an individual, or a confrontation group where you just told each other that you thought the other people sucked. And so for some reason, people took offense in those groups and went out and made sure they were never in a group like that again. That is a mistake. One of many mistakes that's easy to make. It's easy to make mistakes. If you're going to help influence change in a way that sticks and is productive, you need to use some social science. You need to have a framework. And so Lewin then, not only learned that groups were more likely to implement change than individuals that came to trainings. So think about that in your own organization. How many times does your whole team go to a training and have a chance to talk to each other about what makes sense and what doesn't make sense? In most organizations, individuals go to training and they sit there and passively get lectured to. The same thing that didn't work over and over again in all the research Lewin conducted. So if you're going to do a training, get groups together. Get the boss and the employees in the same conversation. Don't do it anonymously. Feedback. Have them talk to each other about what's working and not working. You can influence and improve your own situation, and I'd be happy to help you. So if anyone contacts me, I'll give them free advice. I'm 64. I want this information out there in the world. Lewin thought that the key to having eventually a sound democracy in the United States and elsewhere, and he was very biased in that he thought democracy was the social structure that was preferable. And I share that bias. I'm not afraid of that bias. I want people to be able to influence the society they're in within reason. But you also have to have some restrictions. So Lewin noted that after World War I, German democracy, the Nazis rose to power, Hitler got elected. That was a failure of democracy, and part of the problem was there were no restrictions. People thought democracy meant anyone could say anything and do anything. And so in the name of democracy and free speech, the Nazis went around, seizing their right to free speech and beating the crap out of everybody else. And so that's how they rose to power. So you can't tolerate intolerance if you want a democracy to work. You need people to be able to voice their thinking to a degree, but not hate thinking, not hateful thinking. That's not going to help. There has to be some restrictions for any society to function properly. So, back to Lewin and race relations. He did a bunch of research, action research, including, for instance, in the early housing developments in the U.S. He had a place where there were 4 developments. One was just white. One was just black. And by the way, I'm going to talk more about these racial categorizations, which were created in the United States, white, black, in early Virginia, pre-U.S., the Virginia colony started using the words white and black in law to give poor whites the ability to rule poor blacks, to divide the poor, because the poor had risen up in Bacon's rebellion and almost killed all the rich people who had come over from England, which, by the way, was started as an economic enterprise for the king. The Virginia Company was there to make money. They weren't there for religious freedom. They weren't there for democracy. They were there as representatives of the crown and the class society they brought with them, which is the root of much of our problems in the United States today, is that we came with a class society when they realized that the poor people who they were beating and killing and raping indiscriminately, servants, the poor people actually were rising against them. They used the same system they had used in England to divide and conquer. Sir Francis Bacon famously said that about controlling the poor in England. You have to have a layer in between. You have to take some of the poor people and make them into police and make them into institution, orphanage people and judges and so on, and give them some stake in the society, some land ownership, some home ownership. In Great Britain, they solved part of the problem by letting men rule women at all levels. If you were a poor man but you had a wife, you could beat her. So they gave enough people some status and some power to keep the whole thing from falling apart, because they had lots of rebellions in England leading up until to the time of the colonies. They had lots of rebellions. And so they had applied the same methods in the U.S., and out of that came black, white, and turning the poor whites against the poor blacks. And again, if you look at it from the ruling class's point of view in the Virginia colony, it worked. And then it stuck and it spread. And we're still not over it by any means. But anyway, so Lewin had these 4 developments. And in the 4 developments, 1 white, 1 black, and 2 mixed. They did studies and research as people moved in and later on. And what they found was that in the mixed developments, people started to get over their biases and their prejudice. They started to like each other, and they were even proud of being part of a democratic experiment. In the segregated places, people held on to their prejudices more. And especially in the white segregated building, people didn't even get along with each other. There was more tension amongst neighbors within that segregated building. So somehow they stayed stuck. And so part of the simple thing I do in organizations since 1984 is I bring groups together and help them talk to each other. Maintenance and production, shift 1 and shift 2, engineering, the various corporate experts that are trying to influence every location, usually driving them crazy in the process. Bring them together, have them talk and work together on coming up with solutions, and they can do it. They can do it, and they don't have to be restricted. Like, they don't have to be told to say only nice things. They can say what they really think, and then work together in the right direction if they're allowed to do so. And that's the only way we're ever going to really be a true, strong democracy, is if we have people coming together. And that means white, black, it means all racial categorizations, it means all gender categorizations, sexual identity. Any prejudice begets more prejudice. And so if you think it's okay to be fighting for your own civil rights, but then dismissing someone else's, it's a mistake. Eventually, the dismissal creates the opportunity for others to be dismissive of you. That's what happened in Germany. First, they went for the gypsies and the homosexuals and the Jews, and eventually they came for everybody who stood against the Nazis. And so that's how democracy crumbles. We have to come together, and that is how organizations thrive, bringing groups together that are complaining about each other to figure out how to help each other more. Everyone's dependent and interdependent. And so you need people talking to each other, not talking about each other. And you don't need it to all be anonymous. If it's anonymous, you apparently don't think people can talk to each other. So that's going to get in the way. So be brave, bring people together, study social science before you do it, figure out how to help people be respected as they speak, figure out what are you trying to accomplish and let them know up front so they can think for themselves, and you can change the world. That's what it's all about. Let's make a better world. We can do it. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this first podcast. I'm Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, and proud of it. And I look forward to speaking to you again.